Hello, my zebras and spoonies. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me today. I am glad that you are here. Today, I am going to be talking about my experiences with interstitial cystitis, or IC, and it's an installment in the My Diagnosis series. So I'm getting things back on track. There are only two more that I plan to post for this series, so we're going to be winding down to the end of things. And I don't know what's next. What would you guys like to see for a topic in the next series? I'm open to suggestions, so if you have any, just drop them in the comments. So, all right, let's start where we always do with an explanation of the diagnosis. So, interstitial cystitis is a reoccurring pelvic pain, pressure, or discomfort in the bladder and pelvic region. It's often associated with urinary frequency, which is the need to go often, and urgency, which is a strong or feeling strong need to go. Many describe it as feeling as though they have a urinary infection all the time. Cystoscopic findings show ulceration in the bladder wall. So the cause isn't known. I was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis after I had to go onto a potassium supplement because my potassium kept crashing down to critically low levels. A few days after starting the potassium supplement, I thought I had the worst urinary infection of my life. I was in severe pain, but I went to the doctor and my urine came back as not having an infection. So this led me to getting a urology referral. So my symptoms are pretty classic for IC. So we decided to do the cystoscope to kind of look around and to do the hydrodistension to see if this would relieve some of the symptoms. The scope revealed that I had an extremely ulcerated bladder lining. Lucky for me, the hydrodistension was helpful. It didn't reduce my symptoms to nothing, but it brought things to a level that was manageable. These days, I walk around with a constant feeling of pressure and fullness in my lower abdomen, but nothing that is ridiculous or excruciating. I have been on a pretty restricted diet for years, so there really wasn't anything left for me to call. High potassium foods are a trigger for me, but I can't really do the avoiding potassium thing. Instead, I focus on trying to spread the potassium out over the day rather than taking it in large quantities at a time. I also try to keep the amount of potassium I consume consistent, and I do this with varying degrees of success. Looking back at my life, I have probably had interstitial cystitis for a very long time. I got my first urinary infection when I was a teen, and then I have been diagnosed with urinary infections on a fairly regular basis thereafter. They used to diagnose urinary infections without doing any lab work. They used to just base it on what your symptoms were. Now the standards of practice have changed, and a part of the diagnostic process is to test the urine and to grow it out for bacteria and culture it and see what's cooking. So now I wonder how many of those urinary infections were actually flares of interstitial cystitis, and there's no way to ever know. But I suspect that most, if not all of them, were actually IC flaring rather than me having infections. But because my urine wasn't tested at the time, there isn't any way to know whether or not there was an infection process for sure. So this is a pretty common pattern with chronic illness. You deal with something for years and it's treated under various labels or sometimes without a label at all. And then you finally get your chronic illness diagnosis and you are left with complicated feelings because you inevitably reflect back over the years with a different perspective. So, in context of the interstitial cystitis, I wonder how much damage I could have prevented had I known that there was this inflammatory process occurring in my bladder. Because your prognosis improves if you manage and limit that inflammation. And it was pretty much raging uncontrolled for I don't know how long. So there is one unusual thing about my IC, and that is related to my pain pattern. For most people, the pain is worse when their bladder is full and feels better after they void. For me, it's completely the opposite. My pain is the least when my bladder is full, and it is the worst right after I void. It can be so tempting to not void my urine because I know that it's going to cause me to be in more pain, especially if I'm already having a lot of pain. And that increase in pain usually lasts about a half an hour, but it can be longer if things are flaring. But in the long run, I know that it really is important to void regularly and that you can't just hold your urine forever. I mean, eventually your bladder will just pop. Because my bladder literally is always telling me that I have to urinate, it is difficult for me to tell when I actually have a full bladder. Even right after I void, my bladder will report that it needs to be emptied. The only time its signal for needing to be emptied stops is when I am actively urinating. So my personal strategy for this is to void my bladder on a schedule. I simply ignore my bladder reporting that I need to urinate and instead void when it is the scheduled time. I personally aim for voiding my bladder about every 4 hours. This number comes from years of trial and error that led me to that time frame, just because it's in that range that I tend to have the fewest symptoms. And this is where, or one of the times, that my medical journal and tracking my symptoms over a long period of time can help elucidate what can be helpful and what can be alleviating your symptoms. So this pattern was discovered with the use of a medical journal. And I can't stress enough how much value I feel that a medical journal has when you have chronic illness. I just feel it goes a huge way to helping you manage your illness because it helps you discover those important patterns. So this is one of the diagnoses that people really underestimate the impact it has on your life. Um, The pain is triggered by sitting for too long. But if I stand or walk too much, I have dystonia symptoms. And this means that the best position for my pain relief is to be laying down. And that's just not practical. There are a lot of things that just cannot be done from my bed. And many things are just a whole lot harder to do if I'm in bed. Not to mention that lying down all the time comes with a bunch of risks for your health, so it's just best to avoid living from your bed if you can. And not to mention that my ADHD brain would probably explode if I had to be in bed all the time. The thing is that this diagnosis affects everything. Having to void my bladder every 4 hours means that my sleep is being disrupted or I'm having increased pain. That's the choice. If the pain gets too severe, my sleep will be disrupted anyway. Being on a diet to manage chronic illness is challenging, and the diet for IC is no different. For me, it means being aware of how much potassium is in my food, as this is my primary trigger. So it means reading a lot of labels, it means mathing and figuring out whether or not whatever it is you're looking at eating is a good idea right now. Um, and it means sometimes surprises because, sometimes you just don't realize or you don't spread things out enough, it's not a science. It's kind of an art, and there's a lot of factors that go into it, many of which you can't measure. So there are a lot of things that trigger IC symptoms or exacerbate them and make them worse that I don't have much, if any, control over. So when you have chronic illnesses, it's inevitable that they're going to flare. And if one of my other chronic illnesses is flaring, my IC might jump on that bandwagon and flare along with it. It doesn't matter how good your care plan is. There will always be breakthrough symptoms and flares for your chronic illness. That's just how it is. So even if I am doing everything right to manage my IC, there will be times that for no apparent reason, I'm going to have a flare. But there also means that no matter how good my care plan is, my other chronic illnesses are going to flare, which can trigger my IC. There's also the reality that stress is a thing. So stress management can help reduce the effect of stress, but it's not going to eliminate the very real impacts that stress has on our bodies. And there is no avoiding stress because having chronic illness is stressful. And have you been watching the news lately? This world is stressful. There is no avoiding that I am living in a time that there are 2 active pandemics while working as a bedside nurse with chronic illnesses. Yeah, that's stressful. And stress management techniques are only going to reduce the impact of that stress so much. You know, there's a lot about our bodies that we just take for granted until those functions stop working the way that they're supposed to. And peeing is one of them. Well, that's about it for my rambling today. Thanks for coming and spending some time with me. If you like the video, click the like button. It does help. And until we talk again, you guys take care of yourselves. Bye.